No family took her because she talked to ghosts. A widowed sheriff believed her. The badge was in my coat pocket, not pinned to my chest, the morning I rode out to the Aldrin place to collect a girl nobody wanted. I've been doing that, keeping the badge in my pocket instead of on me since the winter Helen died. 18 months by then. Didn't feel right, wearing it like something to be proud of when the thing I was most supposed to protect I hadn't managed to keep. The town of Crail didn't know that was why. They thought maybe I was getting loose about it, going soft, and the deputy, Moss, had started wearing his a little higher on his chest than he used to, like he was filling a vacancy that hadn't been declared yet. I let him, wasn't the hill I wanted to die on. The Aldrin place sat 4 miles east of town on land that had gone gray and short-grassed since the drought ate it 2 summers back. Walt Aldrin had died in April, heart gave out while he was pulling a calf, and his wife Nora had written to her sister in Tucson and left before the ground was hard enough to dig. Took the 2 boys with her, left everything else. Everything else included a girl named Sierra. She wasn't their blood. They'd taken her in 6 years prior when she was maybe 12, after her parents drowned crossing the Merced River on their way up from the south. She had no last name anyone agreed on. The Aldrins had called her Sierra Aldrin in town, though Walt had never filed papers on it. When Nora left, she told Deputy Moss she couldn't take the girl with her, that her sister's house was small, and the girl was strange, and it wasn't her responsibility when there was no legal claim. Strange. I'd heard that word used about Sierra 3 or 4 times by the time I rode out there. Strange, talks to nobody, talks to people who aren't there, sees things. Moss had driven out twice to see about moving her somewhere, but she wouldn't open the door to him. He seemed to find this more troubling than it probably was. Moss was a good enough deputy, but he had a low ceiling for things that didn't fit his categories. He told me, the second time he came back without her, that he could hear her in there talking, and there was definitely nobody else in the house. So I rode out on a Tuesday early, before the heat came up, with 2 biscuits in a cloth and a clean cup in my saddlebag, because I didn't know what condition things were in out there. The door opened before I got off my horse. She was standing in it with her arms loose at her sides. 18, maybe 19. Dark hair pulled back, but pieces of it coming loose on the left side where she'd slept on it. She was wearing a dress that had been mended at the collar, and the hem, mended careful, whoever did it knew what they were doing. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've been expecting and are only half surprised to see. I said, "Miss Sierra, I'm Sheriff Cade." She said, "I know who you are. Your wife used to buy ribbon from Harmon's on Fridays, blue mostly. She liked the narrower kind." I didn't say anything for a moment. Helen I hadn't thought about that in a long time. The way she'd tie it around things, around the handle of a basket, once around the braid of our daughter's doll. Small habit, narrow blue ribbon. I said, "That's right." She stepped back from the door and held it open. Inside, the place was clean. That surprised me. I'd expected it to be gotten into by animals, at least, or left in the state of someone leaving fast. But it was clean and swept, and the dishes were stacked, and there was laid by, even though it was late enough in the season she didn't need it yet. She'd been taking care of it. I put the biscuits and the cup on the table. She looked at them and then at me and sat down. She didn't take one. She put her hands flat on the table, palms down, and said, "Are you here to move me?" Not a question exactly. More like she was naming what was probably going to happen and giving me the chance to confirm or deny it. I sat down across from her. I said, "I'd like to know what you need." She looked at me steadily. Her eyes were brown, the kind of brown that's almost black in low light, and she had a stillness to her that wasn't timid, wasn't the stillness of someone waiting to be told what to do. It was more like the stillness of someone who decided a long time ago that most of what other people did was noise they didn't have to respond to. She said, "I need them to stop looking at me like I'm a problem to be moved." I said, "Who all has been out here?" "Your deputy, twice, Mrs. Ferris from the church. She brought 2 women with her and they walked through the house making sounds." She paused. The kind of sounds people make when they're about to say something is unfortunate. I knew Mrs. Ferris. I said, "I'm sorry about that." "A man named Prout came out also. He wanted to look at the stock." "Walt Aldrin's cattle." "Yes, he wasn't here about me." She said it without bitterness, just factual. "He looked at the cattle and he looked at me and he said the cattle were in decent shape, and then he left." I sat with that a minute. Outside the window, I could see the yard. A gray cat was sitting in the sun near the fence post. The fence needed work on the north side. I could see the lean of it from where I sat. I said, "How long have you been out here alone?" "Since the 14th of April. "That's 3 months. "Closer to 4. I looked at the clean table, the swept floor, the kindling, the stacked dishes. I said, "You've been managing the place." "Someone had to." I said, "Who's been buying your supplies?" "I've been trading eggs. Mrs. Prout drives past on Thursdays. She stops." I nodded. Hattie Prout was a decent woman even if her husband was primarily interested in other people's cattle. I said, "Sierra, I'm going to be straight with you about what the situation is, and then I'm going to ask you what you want to do." She looked at me. Still waiting. I said, "The Aldrin property is going to go to creditors by December if the estate doesn't get settled. I can't leave you here indefinitely without some kind of arrangement, legal or otherwise, because the county will eventually make that decision for both of us and it'll be worse than anything we work out now. The church has a home for women in Harley. It's decent, I've seen it, or there are families in town who might take a boarder if I asked." I stopped. "There are other things too, depending on what you want, but I need to know what you want." She was quiet for a moment. The cat outside moved off the fence post and disappeared. She said, "People say I talk to ghosts." I said, "I've heard that." She looked at me carefully. "You're not going to tell me I don't." I said, "I'm not going to tell you what you do or don't do. I don't know enough about it." Something moved in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like she'd been waiting for the version of this conversation where the person across from her said something that wasn't what everyone else said, and here it was, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. She said, "Mrs. Ferris said I needed prayer and probably a doctor." I said, "Mrs. Ferris says that about a fair number of things." The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. She looked down at her hands, then back up. She said, "Do you want to know what I actually do?" I said, "Yes." She told me slowly, the way you tell something you've kept for a long time and aren't used to the weight of it being outside your own head. Her mother had been able to do it. That was where it started. Her mother had grown up along the border in a family that passed things down the women's side, things that didn't have a name in English, but in the language her grandmother spoke, it was something like, she paused, tried to remember the word, gave up, something like listening to what's left behind. Not ghosts the way people meant ghosts, not the dead coming to walk around and knock things over. More like, when something big had happened somewhere, the feeling of it stayed. Like heat in stone after the sun goes down. You could feel it if you knew how to be still enough. She'd been 8 years old when she first understood she could do what her mother did. They'd been in a town, she didn't say which one, and I didn't ask, and she'd walked into the livery stable and sat down in the straw and started crying hard, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere you can't name, and her mother had come in and sat beside her and said, "Something happened here, didn't it?" And Sierra had said yes. And her mother had said, "I felt it too." And then she'd explained what it was. What happened in the livery stable, Sierra didn't know. She never found out. But she learned after that to pay attention to what she was feeling when she walked into a place. Learned which feelings were hers and which were older. Learned that some places held a great deal, and some places held almost nothing, and the difference had to do with how much feeling had been pressed into the wood and stone and dirt over time. The Aldrin house held some things, she said. Not bad things. Walter Aldrin had been a decent man in his particular limited way, and there was a kind of stubbornness in the boards of this place that she associated with him, not unpleasant, like the smell of old work. She stopped, said, "I'm sorry, I don't usually talk about this." I said, "Don't apologize." She looked at me again with that careful look. I said, "What do you do when you feel those things in a place?" She said, "Sometimes nothing. Sometimes I just acknowledge it. Sometimes I say something out loud if I'm alone. I don't know if that does anything. It might just be a habit." I said, "That's what people hear, the talking out loud." She said, "Yes." I nodded. She said, "You're the first person who's asked me to explain it instead of just deciding." I didn't have a response to that right away. I looked at the table. At the biscuits she still hadn't touched. I pushed one closer to her. She picked it up. "I need to tell you something about that time in my life, because otherwise none of what happened after makes sense. When Helen died, I went strange myself for a while. I don't use that word to make it comparable to what Sierra had, it wasn't. But I went sideways, is what I mean. I'd be in the middle of something ordinary, hitching a horse, filling out a form, eating breakfast at the counter of the Silver Fork where I ate most mornings because the house was too quiet, and I'd stop. Just stop. Like something had reached in and taken the pin out of the axle and the wheel was still spinning, but it wasn't attached to anything. The deputy noticed. The town noticed in the way towns notice, which is to say they talked about it at a low volume and waited to see if I'd right myself or not. I'd been married to Helen for 19 years. We had one child, a boy named Thomas who died at 4 of a fever, and after that we'd never had another, and that grief had done something to us, not destroyed us, but pressed us closer together the way pressure does to some things. We'd become, I don't know the word for it, not just married, something past that. She was the person who knew what I meant before I said it. She was the person who could look at my back, just the set of my shoulders from across a room, and know whether I was all right. After she was gone, I didn't know who to be in the presence of. I was 53 years old and a widower and a sheriff, and I was a reasonably competent man in most of the practical ways that mattered, and none of that felt like enough to justify the amount of room I was taking up in the world. That's an honest account of where I was. I'm not saying it to make myself interesting. I'm saying it because when Sierra said she was the first person who'd asked her to explain herself instead of deciding, I understood that. I understood it from the inside. I came back the next day. I told myself it was to check on the estate situation, see what condition the cattle were in, talk to her about longer-term arrangements. That was all true. It was also not the whole truth. She was in the yard when I rode up, doing something with a fence post, trying to reseat it in the ground where the frost heave had pushed it up. She had a mallet, and she was working at it steadily, not making a lot of progress. The post was heavy cedar, and she was wedging a rock under the base to get the angle right. I got off my horse and held the post while she drove it. We didn't say much. The work took about 20 minutes. When it was set, she wiped her hands on a rag she kept in her apron pocket and looked at the row of fence. She said, "4 more need doing on the north run." I said, "I can come Saturday if you want another set of hands." She looked at me not suspicious, measuring maybe. She said, "You're the sheriff, you don't have to fix my fence." I said, "I know I don't have to." She went back inside and came out with 2 cups of coffee that she'd had sitting on the back of the stove. She handed me one. We stood at the fence and drank the coffee and didn't talk for a while, which was comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. After a while she said, without looking at me, "There's something in the ground here, along this fence line." I didn't say anything. She said, "Something old, before the Aldrins, whoever was here before them." She paused. "It's not bad, it's just someone worked very hard here for a long time and then left." She frowned slightly. "Or was made to leave, I can't always tell which." I thought about that. The territory had been through a lot of hands. Homesteaders before the Aldrins, and before them, Comanche Range. Before that, whatever came before names I knew. I said, "How does it feel, the thing in the ground?" She thought about it seriously, the way she took most things seriously. She said, "Like when you've been holding something heavy and you put it down and your arms still remember it." I said, "That's a good description." She looked over at me. "You believe me?" I said, "I don't have any reason not to." She turned back to the fence line. She said quietly, almost to herself, "That's new." I came on Saturday. I brought a post driver from the livery and we worked the north fence for most of the morning. She worked beside me, not directing from a distance, but actually working hauling rocks for the bases, tamping the ground around the set posts, holding things when I needed them held. She had a quiet efficiency to her that I associated with people who'd learned to rely on themselves and found it preferable. Around noon she made lunch, salt pork and corn bread and a pot of pinto beans that had been going since morning. We sat at the kitchen table and she'd set it properly, plate and cloth and fork, which I noticed. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the estate." I said, "What have you been thinking?" She said, "If I had income, I wouldn't need to be housed somewhere. I could make an arrangement for this place, caretake it until it settles, or find a room in town and work." She paused. "I can sew, I'm a good cook, I can keep books. Walt Aldrin let me keep his accounts the last 2 years. I said, "You kept Walt Aldrin's accounts." She said, "He didn't like numbers, I do." I nodded. I looked at my plate for a moment and then looked up. I said, "There's a widow in town named Clara Dodd. She runs a dress shop on Main Street, alteration, and custom work. Her girl who helped her got married and moved to Denver in June, and she's been working alone since. Sierra was quiet. I said, she's not an easy woman, but she's fair. If you could sew, she might take you on. Sierra said, I can sew, my mother taught me. A pause. What do you mean, not easy? I said, she says what she thinks. She doesn't make things comfortable to hear. Sierra said, I can manage that. There was something small but unmistakable in her voice when she said it. Not hard. More like she knew what she could manage and had a clear idea of where that line was. I said, I'll speak to her if you want. She looked at me. There was that careful measuring look again, and under it something I couldn't name yet, something she wasn't ready to put a word to. She said, why are you doing this? I said, what do you mean? She said, you came out here twice now. You fixed the fence. You're going to talk to Clara Dodd. She paused. Moss came out twice, and both times he stood on the porch and talked to the door. I said, Moss is a good deputy. She said, that's not what I asked. I set my fork down. I said, you needed somebody to treat you like a person instead of a problem. I know what that's like, not the same way you know it, but close enough. She looked at me for a long time, then she looked at her plate. She said quietly, your wife. I said, yes. She didn't push it further, and I was glad of that, but she'd understood it. I could see that she'd understood it exactly. I talked to Clara Dodd that same afternoon. Clara was a small, straight-backed woman of about 60 who'd come to Crail from Kentucky 15 years ago with a husband who'd died of a snake bite in the second year, which she described without apparent grief as something that had settled several open questions about her life. She had strong opinions about stitching and a low tolerance for people who wasted her time. I sat across from her in the back of the shop where she kept her books, and I told her about Sierra without telling her everything. I told her she was a capable young woman who'd been managing a ranch alone for 4 months and could sew and keep accounts and needed work. Clara said, and the strange part. I said, what strange part? Clara said, Herschel Cade, I have known you for 11 years, and you don't come in here to recommend somebody without looking like there's something you're leaving out. What's the strange part? I said, she keeps to herself and people call her odd. Clara said, half my customers are odd. That's not a disqualifier. She looked at me over her glasses. Is she honest? I said, yes. Clara said, can she hold a seam? I said, I don't know yet. Clara said, bring her in Thursday. I'll see for myself. Thursday, I drove Sierra into town in my wagon. I hadn't planned to do that. I'd meant to just tell her when to go and let her get there on her own. But the morning I'd been going to tell her, I'd ridden out to check on something in that direction anyway. At least that was what I told myself. And she was already dressed to go, standing by the gate waiting, and I said I was headed into town and she could ride with me if she wanted. She said, all right, the way she said most things, no particular performance of gratitude, no excessive politeness, just a plain acceptance of a practical offer. We rode for a while in quiet. The road ran between cut grass and sky, and there were meadowlarks going in the field to the west. She was sitting with her hands in her lap looking at the country. She said without preamble, what was she like? I knew who she meant. I said steady. She was the steadiest person I've ever known. Not in a cold way, she had a temper, she had enthusiasms. But underneath all of it, she was just settled, like good ground. I stopped. I didn't always know how much I depended on that until it wasn't there. Sierra said, how long ago? I said 18 months, February. She looked at the road ahead of us. She said, I can feel her sometimes, in the house when I've been there, at Harmon's once. I held the reins and I said, what does that feel like? She said, warm. Something that was very warm and is still warm, just not on the surface anymore. I looked at the road. She said, I don't know if that means anything to you or if it's just a strange thing to hear. I said, it means something to me. We didn't talk again until we got to town. But when we pulled up at Clara Dodd's shop and I handed her down from the wagon, she took my hand. Just the normal way you take somebody's hand when you're stepping down. Nothing more than that. The warmth of her hand through her glove stayed in my palm for a while after she let go. Clara took her on. She told me so that same Thursday, after Sierra had been in the back of the shop for an hour and a half with a bolt of blue serge and a pattern and Clara watching everything she did. Clara came out to where I was sitting on the bench in front of the sheriff's office, and she stood there a moment and she said, "She can sew. She can also do arithmetic in her head faster than I can do it on paper, which I resent." She paused. "She's coming Monday." I said, "Good." Clara looked at me. She had a way of looking at you that was like being assessed for structural soundness. She said, "She's a particular kind of person, Herschel. The kind who's been handled wrong so many times they've learned to keep most of themselves put away. Takes patience." I said, "I know that kind." Clara kept looking at me. Then she said, "Yes, I expect you do," and went back inside. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Sierra worked at Clara's 4 days a week. On the other days she was out at the Aldrin place, which she kept on maintaining even as the legal situation around it stayed uncertain. I came out most Saturdays, sometimes Sundays, usually with a practical reason and sometimes without one. We got in the habit of sitting on the porch after whatever work there was to do, usually with coffee, watching the light change on the grass. She talked more as the weeks went on. She told me about her parents. Her father had been a quiet man with a quick laugh, a carpenter's hands, she said, big and scarred and very precise. Her mother she described with a kind of careful reverence, like something she didn't want to reduce by trying to say it all. She said she was the one who understood everything about me. After she was gone, I kept looking for someone else who could. She paused. I mostly stopped looking. I said, "Why'd you stop?" She said, "Because looking for it made me into something I didn't want to be. Waiting for someone to see you, it makes you desperate. I'd rather just be what I am and let people make their own decisions about it." I thought about that. I said, "And if nobody does?" She said, "Then you live with that." I looked at the grass. I said, "That's a hard way to live." She said, "There are harder ways." I thought about the 18 months since February. I said, "Yes, there are." She looked at me sideways, that almost smile again. In October, she saw something that mattered. I need to be careful how I say this because I want to say it right. I don't have a way to explain what Sierra could do in terms that make it neat or scientific, and I stopped trying to explain it that way early on. What I can tell you is what happened and what it led to. There was a man in Crail named Baxter who ran the feed store. He was on the town council and he sang in the church choir, and he had a wife named Margaret who never came to town without him and always stood 2 steps back when she did. I'd had a low feeling about Baxter for years, nothing I could put into a report, nothing that had ever crossed the line into something I could act on. He was careful. Men like that are usually careful. Sierra had been in the store twice on errands for Clara Dodd. The first time she came out and didn't say anything. The second time she came back to the shop and stood by the back counter and didn't pick up her work for a few minutes. Clara said, "What is it?" Sierra said, "That place. Something's very wrong in that place." Clara looked at her. Clara was not a woman who spooked easily, and she was not a woman who dismissed things easily either. She said, "What kind of wrong?" Sierra said, "Something's been happening there for a long time, and everyone's gotten used to not seeing it." She told Clara this. Clara told me that same afternoon in the back of the shop with the door closed. I said, "What exactly did she say?" Clara told me. I sat with it, then I said, "Has anyone ever asked about Margaret Baxter?" Clara said, I've wondered for years. She used to come in here for fittings before Baxter started driving her everywhere and doing the picking up himself. After that, I stopped seeing her alone." I said, "When did that change?" Clara said, 6, 7 years ago. I looked at the wall. I said, "All right." What happened after that I'll tell you straightforwardly because it's not complicated, just slow and careful. I didn't act on what Sierra had felt. I used it as a direction to look, and I looked, the way a careful man looks, with documentation and witnesses and things that would stand in a courtroom. It took 2 months. Herb Fannin, who'd worked for Baxter 5 years back, was willing to talk when I found him in Bledsoe where he'd moved his family. His wife had seen things. His wife would testify. The doctor in Harley who'd treated Margaret Baxter for a broken wrist 3 years ago and written it down as a fall from a horse. He was willing to look me in the eye when I sat across from him and say that the injury pattern hadn't matched the story. By December, I had enough. Baxter was arrested the week before Christmas. It was quiet, as those things go. I did it myself, just me and Moss, early in the morning before the town was up. Baxter said on his porch in the cold that I'd lost my mind and he'd have my badge. I told him he was welcome to make that case from whatever cell he ended up in. He was a man who'd gotten used to the idea that his particular kind of careful made him untouchable, and having that certainty removed from him was, I won't say satisfying. It was more like a long, overdue correction in an account that had been running wrong for years. Margaret Baxter moved in with her sister in Harley after the new year. The town talked about it for weeks. Several people asked me how I'd known to look at Baxter. I said I'd gotten information from a reliable source and left it there. Nobody pressed too hard. People, in my experience, accept the answers they're given when the outcome seems right. I went to tell Sarah the day Baxter was taken. She was at Clara's. I came in through the back and she was at the long table with a length of green wool, pins in her mouth, and she looked up when I came in and took the pins out. I said, Baxter's in custody. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the pins down on the table, each one deliberately, and she said, his wife. I said, she's safe. She put her hand over her eyes for a moment. Not crying, or not quite, more like she needed a second to take in the size of it. Then she put her hand down and she looked at me with an expression I want to describe carefully because I don't want to get it wrong. It wasn't gratitude, though there was some of that. It was something more like relief, that the thing she'd felt and reported had been taken seriously and had led somewhere real. That she hadn't been patted on the head or redirected or looked at like she was the problem. That she'd said here is something wrong and a man had believed her and done something about it. She said quietly, you believed me. I said yes. She looked at me a long time. Then she said, most people don't. I said, I know that. She said, why did you? I thought about it. I said, because I've been a sheriff for a long time and I've learned that the truth comes in different shapes. Not all of them look like evidence. Some of them look like a woman in a shop who goes very still and says something's wrong. I've learned not to throw those away. She stood very still. She said, that's not the whole answer. She was right. I said, no, it's not. She waited. I said, because I was paying attention to you, the way I haven't paid attention to much of anything in about 2 years. And when you said something was wrong in that place, I believed it because you believed it, and because I'd come to know what kind of person you are, and I trust your judgment. She looked at me. She wasn't going to let me off easy, and I didn't want her to. She said, and what kind of person am I? I said, careful, honest. You see things accurately even when they're hard to see. You don't tell people what they want to hear, and you've been alone for a long time carrying something that most people were too lazy or too frightened to try to understand. I stopped. And you've done it without becoming bitter, which I find remarkable. She looked down at the green wool on the table. Then she looked back up. She said, I haven't been entirely alone. Not these last months. The weight of that was considerable. I said, no, not entirely. Christmas Eve, she came to my house. I hadn't invited her. I want to be clear about that, not because it was wrong of her to come, but because I want you to understand the nature of what she did. She wasn't responding to an invitation. She came of her own accord. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which was how I spent most evenings, not thinking about anything in particular, just living inside the quiet, when I heard footsteps on the porch and then a knock. She was standing there in her coat with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she had something wrapped in cloth in her hands. She said, I made something. I stood back and let her in. She came into the kitchen and put the wrapped cloth on the table. She unfolded it. Inside was a pie apple. The smell of it hit me before I even got to the table. And beside the pie, a folded piece of cloth that turned out to be a new shirt, blue, very well made, which I later found fit me exactly. I said, when did you have time to make a shirt? She said, I make things. It's faster than you'd think. I looked at the shirt. I looked at her. She said, I didn't want to spend tonight alone, and I didn't know if you did either. I said, I don't. She sat down. I cut the pie. We sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and ate pie, and drank the coffee I reheated, and she talked about her mother's Christmas customs, the specific songs, a particular kind of pastry her grandmother made. And I talked about Thomas, just a little, a Christmas when he was 3 and had been convinced there was a horse for him, and we'd given him a wooden one that his grandfather had carved, and his face when he saw it, not disappointed, Not exactly, just recalibrating. I'd always loved that about him. 3 years old and he could recalibrate. She listened the way she listened to most things, with her full attention and no performance of feeling. Just actually there in the room with me. At some point the night had gotten fully dark, and the lamp was the only light, and we'd stopped talking and were just sitting. She had her hands around her coffee cup. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Do you feel her here, in this house?" I said, "Sometimes." She said, "What does it feel like?" I thought about it. I said, "Like a room you know so well you can walk through it in the dark. You know where everything is. You don't need the light." Sarah looked at me. Then she said, "She was right to love you." It landed somewhere I hadn't expected. I didn't have an answer for it right away. My throat did something. I said, "She'd have liked you." Sarah said, "I know." She said it simply, not presumptuous. Like something she'd worked out on her own and was fairly confident about. We sat in that kitchen until late. Outside the window, the first snow of the season started coming down, just light and soundless, and I noticed it first when the lamp started reflecting off the white of it through the glass. After Christmas, things changed. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened. But the shape of things shifted, the way it does when two people have been circling around something true and finally stop pretending they're not. I came out to the Aldrin place less for the practical reasons, and more because I wanted to. She stopped explaining why she'd done something for me the way you explain yourself to someone you're not sure is keeping an account. We started talking about things that were just things. The territory, history, what she wanted eventually, what I thought the county would look like in 10 years, books she'd read when the Aldrins had any to read, which were few. January, she told me she'd heard from the estate's creditor that there was interest in the property from a family out of Abilene. She said it without visible upset, but I knew her well enough by then to see the thing underneath it. I said, "Where would you want to go?" She said, "I'd want to stay." I said, "In Crail?" She looked at me directly. She said, "Yes." I said, "You could stay at Clara's probably. She has the room above the shop." Sarah looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Is that what you're offering me?" The weight in that question was significant. I said, "No, that's not what I'm offering you." She waited. She was very still. I said, "I'm 54 years old and I'm a widower and I'm a county sheriff in a small town, and I know that's not much to put in front of somebody." I stopped. "But if you wanted to stay here with me, I'd make sure you never had to be alone again." She looked at me. I said, "You've been carrying yourself alone for a long time. I've been doing the same. I don't know that we have to keep doing that." She said, "You believe me." I said, "I believe you." "Yes." She said, "You're not going to wake up one morning and decide I'm strange and pull back." I said, "No." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I've already had every opportunity to do that, and I didn't." She looked at the window. The January light was thin and cold through the glass, and it lit the side of her face clearly. She said, "What does this look like, what you're describing?" I said, "I don't know exactly. Something real and something honest and something that doesn't require you to be something you're not." I stopped. "I'm not asking you to be Helen. I'm not asking you to fill a shape someone else left. I'm asking if you want to build something that's its own shape." She turned back from the window. She looked at me and I could see it. The thing she'd been keeping put away, to use Clara's word, the part of her that had learned to protect itself by not expecting much. She was looking at me the way she looked at something she was deciding whether to trust. She said, "I'm not easy either, you know." I said, "I know that." She said, "I see things other people don't see, and it makes them uncomfortable, and I'm not willing to stop." I said, "I don't want you to stop." She said, "I've been told I'm difficult." I said, "By people who wanted you to be easier. I don't want you to be easier. I want you to be yourself." She was quiet for a while. The lamp in the kitchen hummed. Outside, wind moved the dry grass along the fence. She said, "All right." Just that, all right. We were married in March at the courthouse, with Clara Dodd and Deputy Moss as witnesses. Moss had been told enough to be polite and not ask questions, which was the most I needed from him. Clara wore her good coat and brought a small cake from the bakery and stood there with her hands folded, and I suspected she was proud of herself for having had a hand in things, which she was entitled to be. The ceremony itself was brief. The judge was a practical man who didn't perform any more than was required. When it was done, and I had the license in my hand and Sierra had her hand in mine, Clara stepped forward and kissed Sierra on the cheek and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Good. You're both too stubborn to be alone." Then she straightened up and said in her normal voice, "I'll need you in Thursday." Moss shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, Sheriff," and couldn't quite keep the surprise out of his voice, which was fair. That evening we were in my house. Our house now, I was still getting used to that. And Sierra was unpacking the things she'd brought over in 2 cases and a trunk. And I was in the kitchen heating up the supper I'd made, which I had warned her beforehand would be edible but not much more than that. And I could hear her moving in the other rooms, the particular sound of her moving, which I'd learned over these months and could identify. And it struck me that the house wasn't quiet the way it had been quiet before. Not loud, just not empty. She came into the kitchen carrying a small framed picture, which she set on the mantelpiece without asking me about it. I looked over. It was a photograph of 2 people I didn't recognize, her parents, I understood, without her having to say it. A man and a woman standing close together, the woman with her hand on the man's arm, both of them looking at something off to the side of the frame. She stood back and looked at the mantelpiece. I said, "That's where it belongs." She looked over at me. I said, "They should be here." She came to the kitchen. She stood beside me where I was at the stove, and she put her hand on my back, not a gesture, not a performance, just her hand, flat against my back, and she stood there. We stayed like that for a little while. The supper heated. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. That spring the Aldrin property sold to the family from Abilene, and the man came to town to finalize the deed and asked around about who had maintained the place, and Sierra's name came up. He came to the shop to find her. He told her the place had been in better shape than he'd expected, that whoever had kept it had done right by it, and he said it like it surprised him. Sierra thanked him plainly and went back to her work. Clara told me about it that evening. She said she didn't make anything of it, said it like she approved. I said, "That's her way." Clara said, "I know it is. It's a good way." There were people in Crail who never quite settled their minds about Sierra. That's the truth, and I'm not going to make it prettier than it was. Some people had decided who she was before they ever had a conversation with her, and those people didn't revise easily. She was aware of it, and she didn't lose sleep over it, which was in itself a kind of dignity that I admired without saying so. The people who spent real time with her, Clara, the women she worked for and with, eventually Hattie Pruitt, who'd been decent to her from the beginning, those people came around to their own view of her, which was generally a high one. She was precise, she was reliable, she was honest to the point of being inconvenient sometimes, and she was good at her work. Those things accumulate over time. That's all character is, mostly things that accumulate over time. She kept doing what she did. The feeling of places, the old residue of things. She was quieter about it in public, but she didn't stop. There were 3 or 4 times over the years that she'd say something to me quietly about somewhere or someone, and I'd take it the way I'd learned to take it, not as a report, not as evidence, but as a direction to look. She was right more often than she was wrong, significantly more often. I never told anyone that. Some things you keep to yourself, not because you're ashamed of them, but because they belong to a particular life, and you don't need other people filing through them. The summer I turned 58, I had a bad season. It came on the way those things do, not all at once, but in gradual accumulation. A case that had gone wrong, a man I'd had in custody on good evidence who got out on a procedural problem, and then did what I'd known he'd do, and the family that resulted was a family in Crail that I had to look at every time I walked to the office. That sat in me badly. On top of that, a drought like the one 2 summers back was tightening on the valley, and there was stock going thin, and tempers going short, and a fight in June that left one man with a broken collarbone and another one with a knife wound in his side, and neither of them were going to press charges, which meant whatever had been going on between them would keep going on. I stopped sleeping well. I sat up at night in the kitchen the way I used to before. Sierra knew, she always knew with me. The way she'd explained it once, she didn't feel me the way she felt places. It was different with living people, less definite. But she'd lived alongside me long enough to read me the ordinary way, through the particular way I held my jaw and where I put my hands, and whether I was looking at the room or through it. She didn't make a project of me. I want to say that plainly. She didn't sit me down and tell me what was wrong with me or make the bad season into a conversation I was obligated to have. What she did was, she arranged things. She came down when I was sitting up at 2 in the morning and she didn't make it a thing. She just made coffee and sat across from me, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't. And after a while I'd go back to bed and sleep some. She said to me one of those nights, "You know the Baxter arrest didn't cause what happened to that family in June." I said, "I know that." She said, "You know it in your head. You're not sure about the rest of it yet." I didn't say anything. She said, "That's all right. The rest of it catches up." I said, "Has it for you, with your parents?" She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Mostly. It catches up to different parts at different times. Sometimes something catches me off guard still." She paused. "That doesn't mean it hasn't healed. It just means the thing was real." I sat with that. She said, "You're a good sheriff, Herschel. I've watched you work for 4 years now. I know what a good sheriff looks like." She said it with the same quality she brought to everything, not to make me feel better, but because it was accurate and she was reporting an accurate thing. "The case went wrong because of a procedural failure, not because of you. I know you know that. I'm telling you I know it too." I looked at her across the table. She said, "The people of this county are safer because you're their sheriff. That's a fact, not a comfort. There is a particular kind of being seen that doesn't come often, where someone looks at you and what they see is not who you were or who you might be, but who you actually are, clearly and without editing. Helen had been able to do that. After Helen was gone, I hadn't expected to have it again. Sierra was looking at me that way. Had been, I realized, from the beginning. From the porch of the Aldrin house the first morning, when she'd named the blue ribbon without preamble, like she'd already read me through and was starting further in. I said, "I don't know that I've ever told you what this has meant to me." She said, "You don't need to tell me." I said, "I want to." She waited. I said I was done. Not outwardly. Outwardly I was functioning, I was adequate, I showed up. But inwardly I had concluded things about what my life was going to be from then on, what was available to me. I stopped. I'd decided that the part of my life where I was known by somebody, that was behind me, and I was living with that. I had got to a place where I was living with it without making a fuss. She was very still. I said, "And then you opened the door before I got off my horse and you talked about blue ribbon and you kept the house clean for 4 months when you didn't have to. And you didn't open the door for Moss, but you opened it for me. And I don't know." I stopped again. "I don't know entirely why, except that something in me recognized something in you, and it turned out I wasn't as done as I thought." She looked at me, in the lamplight, 4 in the morning in the kitchen of a house that was ours. She came around the table and she sat beside me close, her shoulder against mine, and she put her hand over my hand where it lay on the table. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand over mine and left it there. That was enough. That was more than enough. "I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'll leave it where it is." The spring I turned 60, we were out at the edge of the property one evening. The house had a north field that we'd put a kitchen garden in over the years, and Sierra had been working it that afternoon, and the light was going gold, and long across the grass, the way it does in May when the air has finally stopped being cold. She was washing her hands at the pump. She had dirt on her forearms up past her wrists, and she was working it off, and her hair had come loose on the left side the same way it had the first morning I'd seen her, and I was standing at the fence watching the light. She came and stood beside me. She dried her hands on her apron. After a while she said, "Something happened here." I said, "In the field." She said, "Right here at the fence, years ago." She was quiet for a moment. "Something good. Someone stood here for a long time looking at something they were very glad of." I looked at the field, the kitchen garden, the stakes for the beans she'd put in last week, the far tree line going dark. She looked at me sideways. She said, "It feels like you." I said, "I've been standing here most evenings for years." She said, "I know," quietly. "That's what I mean." I looked at her. She was looking at the field, not at me, and there was a particular quality to her profile, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her, that I don't have a word for. She was not a woman who performed what she felt. She was not a woman who needed to. The feeling came through the plain surface of things, the same way she felt feelings come through the surfaces of places, and if you knew how to be still enough, you could receive it. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it, the small, familiar weight of her against my side. The light went on changing across the grass. There are things you know in your head and things you know elsewhere. I knew elsewhere that I was standing in the right place with the right person, at the fence of something I'd built and was glad of, with the evening coming on and the birds going quiet in the tree line and a woman beside me who had chosen, of her own free will, with full knowledge of what I was and what I was not, to stand here. That's the whole of it. That's what I've got to tell you. The light was very gold.